Good afternoon. How are we doing? I'm not going to thank you. I'm not going to ask you if you can hear because I have no way to turn it up. But hopefully you can hear, and it's all good. Wonderful. My name is Carl Kreisman. It's been my pleasure to work with the library since 2017 and doing a variety of programs. For the last 3, we've had 2 series that go with the same over the year, opposite months. This one is called Past Meets Present, and then the other one is called Citizen Civics. And so we kind of dig into the different, I'll show you a schedule of events that are coming up so you can, if you're interested and want to find out some different things. They're all sort of around history. I am the chair of the history discipline on the East Campus of Valencia College. And so it's a great joy to be here, and I appreciate you coming and being interested. When we do Past Meets Present, obviously we're usually talking about singular moments, and we've done everything from battles to individuals to groups like the history of NASA. And then we do Citizen Civics. We're looking at the idea of what does it mean to be a citizen in a unique structure like the United States is. And it's still somewhat unique, though it's less unique today than, say, 250 years ago when we started. And so we're kind of looking at those aspects of what it means for there to be a unique structure. So hopefully you'll come along for the ride. Today I want to tell you what I consider one of the most amazing little stories of a little village that I now know to say most of you have never heard of. But if you travel yourself into the Midwest, you need to go see as we kind of look at and examine the longer story around abolition. So here we go. We're going to dive right on in. In 1862, Harriet Beecher Stowe met President Lincoln. Now, the evidence behind what was said, oh, am I twisted here? The evidence behind what was said in the meeting is there's not as much hard evidence as historians like, but famously, as you can see there, President Lincoln said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." And of course, what he's alluding to is Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was living in Maine at the time. We'll come back to this a little bit later. And so she told the story of, you may know of, a lot of people know of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and very few people have actually read Uncle Tom's Cabin. But it's a wonderful story and kind of helped, and we'll show this in a moment, really pick up the energy of the events that lead to the Civil War itself. And so there's this story that she tells in here, and at the heartbeat of Uncle Tom's Cabin is the story of Eliza crossing the river, nearly frozen, the river itself, and then herself after falling in 3 times. This is really a story of how we get to the Civil War. And as you hopefully are aware, at the center of our Civil War is our great scourge and sin and disappointment of slavery. And if we, and hopefully you are, someone who finds appropriate embarrassment, appropriate sense of disappointment, appropriate sense of, not really disillusionment, but a sense of maybe frustration, particularly when you consider someone like Jefferson and his laudatory words and then his evil actions as a human. And you go, ah! Of course, when I look in the mirror, I go, oh, well, that explains everything. Because the human has that, and as you know, slavery is still alive and well today in the world. And I hope you personally find yourself as someone who battles against slavery, whether you use and support international groups like International Justice Mission, or groups right here locally in Central Florida, United Abolitionists, who are on the forefront of fighting to try to end slavery. Slavery exists in this region. It exists in this country. And so we should appropriately in the year 2024 find ourselves still embarrassed and frustrated. And yet somehow, at least at one level, if we can detach ourselves a little bit, we can say, there's something about us as a species that this still is in us. If the United States bears a sense, at least I feel like, of remorse or shame for this, equally true is the fact that the United States was one of the very first nations, as a nation and people within the nation, to say openly slavery should end. Slavery should not be something that is normative to the species. Now, we obviously haven't made it. We make laws, and we have, in some level, done the things to kind of take it out of the spotlight so that it's on the surface and kind of put it off to the side. But again, my last look, the count was it was somewhere over 100 million people were enslaved worldwide. And again, I know it's active in this city. And again, if you don't feel that's something, go to United Abolitionists because they're local, and talk to Thomas and those guys who kind of lead that up. So it's important for us as we acknowledge slavery to also acknowledge the abolition movement, and that it was an official movement of things that happened. Now, before we dive any further in, let me hasten to say that as long as we've had slavery, and as I just said to you, as long as we've had historical record of humans, we've had slavery. And so now, 5,000 plus years later, we have historical record of humans, and we still have slavery. But as long as we've had slavery, people have sought to escape slavery, which seems obvious on its face, but it's important to make sure you recognize talking about the abolition movement or the Underground Railroad is not to say previous to this moment, people who were enslaved did not seek to gain freedom. So again, from the very moment anybody was enslaved, they sought to find their way out. And again, I stress, slavery global, every tribe, every race, every continent. So there's not like some race doing it to somebody else. Actually, slavery is never about race, it's always about power. It's always about power. But so, if we can talk about slavery, we can look at, and if we can find the shame in Jefferson, Washington, and some others who had slavery, I think we should find the honor and the glory even in those individuals who said, no, I want to openly oppose this. And prior to the Civil War, to openly oppose slavery came at great personal cost to them. When we talk about abolition, this is the story we typically talk about right here, that William Lloyd Garrison in 1831 published a newspaper called The Liberator. He formed then a local New England anti-abolition society, which eventually expanded to be a United States Abolition Society. At this, very famously, one of his meetings, Frederick Douglass showed up as a former slave, runaway, and stood up and extemporaneously gave a speech that was brilliant. The man was a brilliant man, would have been an amazing president had he had the opportunity, and became the leading figure, in some sense maybe initially as kind of a poster child, but then eventually the intellectual and fighting force about abolition. And we think of the abolition movement as a New England experience or an East Coast experience. We hear about some of the champions like Harriet Tubman, or some of the lesser known but still very important champions like William Still. And yet, the story that I want to tell you today is one that just fascinates me. The first time I heard of it about 20 years ago, and I'm like, that can't be right. That was my thought. That actually, at the center of the abolition movement is the state of Ohio, and a small little village most of you have never heard of, some maybe 40 miles down the river from Cincinnati, called Ripley. And that Ripley, Ohio, and Ohio broadly, really should sit at the center of the Underground Railroad and the center of what becomes the second wave of the abolition movement. So I want to tell you this story. Men like John Rankin, men like Dr. Lyman Beecher, and of course that's Harriet's dad, are critical to our story. Our story is going to center on Ripley, but at the same time, it's going to expand out to kind of examine kind of what happens, in and around Ohio, which, of course, at this point, when we start our story, there is no Ohio. There's just the land that we had taken as part of the treaty in 1783 with England that was broadly considered the United States. So we're going to back up. So after we fought the war, we had this land, and as you remember, actually I'll go forward and come back. I'll come back to this, I promise. As you remember, from our fighting of the war, we got everything to the Mississippi River and all this land. But as you may not remember, but you should be told, when the colonies were first founded, all the way back to Jamestown and the Pilgrims and certainly the Puritans, as they developed and went along from kind of an initial location to more people to eventually a kind of a sense of a named calling like Virginia or the Carolinas, they all had a charter. And on that charter, almost all of them, their charter was basically sea to shining sea. Now, they didn't know how big that was. That's one of the things Lewis and Clark will do in the same time period to kind of give us a better examination of what the continent looks like. But what that meant was, as you can see on the map here, all this land was considered previously owned by these guys. Now, some small ones like Delaware, they were already kind of landlocked, they were kind of stuck. But as I've told you here before and have often made a joke about, from Virginia's point of view, really what we call the United States should be the United States of Virginia. That the whole continent largely, certainly from this line here, although initially they thought of this, they thought they gave that land to the Carolinas. But certainly this line here, and then kind of follow the river, and so it just goes all the way up to there. And just think of it going all the way like to the Arctic, and so that huge triangle is all Virginia. And so all this land was here. Now by the time we get to the Articles of Confederation from 1781 to 1787, our first government, our first expression of the United States, this land down here, of course, was still largely populated by our 5 civilized tribes, the phrase we use, the Choctaw, Creeks, Cherokees, Seminoles. This is Virginia. And so Virginia and Virginians here and Carolinians here had already really populated this land. So that meant this land here, north of the Ohio River, was unoccupied, largely, from European-based peoples. So the Articles of Confederation thought we should try to make some money. One of the challenges for the Articles was funding itself. So we should try to make some money. The way we would make some money is we could sell this land, all right? So that led the Articles of Confederation, our Congress, to pass a series of Northwest Territory ordinances, in which first thing they had to do is convince leaders from Virginia, New York, and Massachusetts to give up claim to the land, which they finally did. A little arm twisting got involved there. And then they laid it all out, they organized it, and they began to create rules behind it. And their idea behind doing this was to first sell the land, like I said, but then basically structure the land so it'd be very well organized. Now, into the mix of this comes leaders from New England. This is important to help explain how does this land, and in particular Ohio, end up as this heartbeat of abolition. Again, let me say, if you'd gone to the United States in 1787 and said, should we or should we not have slavery, besides the blank stares from most people going, I'm not even sure why you're asking me that question, you would have gotten, well, I'll go and say 100%. Well, yeah, of course, why not? Why wouldn't we? Every other country on the planet has this, right? So that'd be a general, maybe I'm being unkind, maybe it'd be 90%, maybe 85%. But if there were people opposed, and actually there were, so I know it's not 100%. If there were people opposed, they largely would have been in New England for a variety of reasons. Keep in mind, back to this map, all 13 states have slavery at this point. There's not a single state that has outlawed slavery. So everybody has slavery, legal slavery in their state. But there's movement happening in the 1780s into the 1790s, particularly up here in New England, to outlaw it at their state level. And then they will in the 1790s into the early 1800s, all the way down here to the line, which we eventually know is the Mason-Dixon line, between Pennsylvania and Maryland, and thus Virginia as well. So they're going to, but at the time that this is happening for the Congress, that's not the story. Okay, is everybody with me so far? I'll try to have questions at the end, but you can remember, I've always told you before, you can always interrupt me. It's always better if you have a question to throw that hand up and I'll try to answer it right then when you're thinking about it, than try to remember it an hour later, kind of a thing. All right, so our friends in New England were some of the key ones that say, hey, look, we need to make sure this is done orderly. You can see they kind of actually designed it, all this land, which of course becomes states later, would all be laid out in little parcels. They didn't want what had happened before because, again, the normative human experience, and this was true for the United States, was first come, first served. And whatever you can lay out as kind of markers and put some quote-unquote claim to is yours. The whole reason George Washington stumbles us into what we call the French and Indian War is because he's in the Ohio River Valley near modern-day Pittsburgh to claim land for himself as well as for Virginia. He's there as a surveyor. That's the whole reason he's there. It's like the guys on the road holding the sign. You've seen them, and now, of course, they use digital and all that kind of stuff, looking through the little tripod. What are they doing? They're trying to make sure, now we're using satellites to say, where is this, so it can be marked on to a map somewhere so we can all know that's his, that's not his. And so the New England people are like, no, we don't want to do that. And so one of the other things that's really important then for how they began to organize this land was that they wanted to make sure that all the land in what would then be called the Northwest Territory could have some things that they valued in Virginia, in New England. And one of the things that they valued, as I just told you, was the beginning of saying, we need to end slavery. So these leaders in New England most of them that I'm talking about are not members of Congress, some of them are, will begin working in Congress. This is the Articles of Confederation Congress, this is before the Constitution is written, our second government. And they will work it out to where in the last of the Northwest Territory ordinances, slavery will be disallowed. Now it's important for you to get this map. Lock this map in your head to understand. Today we know there's a state called West Virginia. That state does not exist. So take that map out of your mind. And instead look at this map. This land will be bordered on the Ohio River all the way up to this little corner by Virginia. So Virginia loves slavery. Yay, we want slavery. So the important for you to see then as we're talking about this is the growth of the Underground Railroad and the growth of abolition, you now are going to have a very clear marker here between Virginia and this. Now eventually we'll call this Kentucky, as you know, but in essence, if you're Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, you're bordered by slave-holding Virginia on all sides. Right? Does that make sense? So what they're going to do is they will work to try to create a setting in which New Englanders can buy some of the land. So they will form this and call this the Ohio Company, named after the river, and they will successfully petition Congress to be really the first major purchase of the land in the Northwest Territory ordinances. And that'll be this land right here, this little corner of Ohio, the Ohio Company purchased. But into the document then, these two crucial parts here in Article 3 and Article 6 show the viewpoint of the New Englanders, and they're connected. The first one, obviously, as you can see, being about the fact that we think there should be, at some level, state support for education. And why? Because religion, morality, and knowledge are necessary to good government. Now, this bugs a lot of people today because we don't like to talk about spiritual issues. But nonetheless, it's vital for us to just accept, whether I think of myself as religious or not, that in our founders' viewpoint, a vital aspect of what made the foundation possible for civic government of the people was a moral and virtue foundation. And the simplest way for you to say, what are they saying, is like, when you go to stop signs, do you want there to be a cop on every corner to enforce or show you the threat of the government in order to get people to stop? Or do you want to live in a society in which we trust one another because of the moral and virtue foundation? That's the simplest way to put it. It's more technical than that, as you can imagine. And so they're thinking, well, the only way to make that happen is to teach it to the children. And I've had 3 children, and I've worked with children pretty much all my life. So if you've ever had children of your own, you realize you have to teach them morals and virtues. Locke is wrong. We are not just born naturally good, compliant, and obedient. Doesn't mean we're evil, but it does mean we challenge ourselves, at least my 3 did, and kids I've worked with challenge themselves to obey or to follow or to be nice. I didn't have to teach my daughters to hit their sisters. And my wife and I, we don't do any physical, violent type of things. We don't even like watching shows like that. So somehow my kid at 2 and 1 just knew that lashing back out. Where does that come from? Well, that's a whole different spiritual conversation, but our founders thought if we don't want that out of our adults, we have to teach them not to and how not to when they're little. And that'll come through education. So in the Northwest Territory, we want this kind of education, and then specifically no slavery nor involuntary servitude in the territory. So they make that part of the process. Well, this also kind of leads us then, back to this map for a second. You can see here the Virginia Military Survey. Remember what I told you a moment ago, for Virginians, all this land is theirs. But once they concluded that they would give it to the government to sell, they still asked for what became known as the Virginia Military District, which is like right here, as you can see in this land. It's technically part of Ohio, but in Virginia's mind, it's just this land in the north of what we now call Kentucky. And what that was designed to do, as they tied it into the Northwest Territory ordinances, was to provide a place for Virginians who had been veterans of the war to go and have land, kind of a payoff for them. But also, in particular, veterans who wanted to free any and all slaves that they had. So it became a place where you could escape Virginia's social pressure and social expectation. If you had, remember, the average person all the way through the Civil War, if they had slaves, they had one or two. That's like 80%. Then there's about 15% who had somewhere between 2 and 10. So if you had more than 10, you were among the elite. It would mean, like today, is if you had, I don't know, $5-6 million in stock in something people now think maybe is evil, like an oil company or something, or I don't know who's the current bad boy in social media, but you had that in social media, and everybody's like, you have them, they're terrible, kind of a thing, and you had a moral sense. But the societal around you would be to say, well, you're rich, so keep that, and you want to give that up because you find it somewhat embarrassing yourself. Does that make sense? So you could go to the Virginia Military District north of the Ohio and kind of have a legal reason that you could free your slaves and then be kind of escaping any kind of social pressure from Virginia. So into our story comes this man, James Pogue. James Pogue was a Virginian. He had grown to detest slavery. He had 20 slaves, so you know he's one of the elites. He's from a family of elites. And he goes to Virginia Military District so that he can free his slaves. He gets 1,000 acres off the river. They eventually call the place Staunton. They'll change the name to Ripley later, as you can see, in honor of a World War II veteran. I don't know any reason why they did that. There's not some connection between Pogue and this gentleman, nor between this gentleman and the land, but they just wanted to honor him for some, we didn't have that many heroes in the War of 1812 anyway, so I guess they wanted to kind of honor him. As you can see, one of the things that begins to be an impact for this area is that 15 of the 20 slaves wanted to stay. This becomes a real issue of what the abolition movement will confront, what to do with former slaves, which we'll get to in a second. But it's interesting to say, so right from the get-go, Pogue is taking his 1,000 acres, which will become the city of Ripley, and in that region, 15 of his 20 slaves said, well, we just want to stay here. He kind of assumed they would want to leave, but if they wanted to stay, he was fine, and they basically helped him build the town. So Staunton, Ripley, built by a biracial society, right? So you already can see where we're going with this. That's why Ripley becomes so important to the story. And it became a place that began to attract people. The first significant one was one of the very first U.S. senators who was an open abolitionist, and he paid for it, both politically and personally, Dr. Alexander Campbell, who will move to Ripley in 1815 after he served in the Senate and kind of stay there as a physician, but stay there as kind of this open abolitionist in the story. Now, the fact that slavery had been abolished did not mean that everybody in the land was somehow happy with either the ending of slavery or with the abolition movement itself. It's important for you to realize all the way to 1861 at the start of the war, and I would offer even during the war itself, which you see when you get to the Emancipation Proclamation, which we have dealt with here before, abolition is both controversial and largely unpopular amongst the North. It's always easy to kind of castigate the South by the time we get to the Civil War, as if the Southerners were this place of evil and the North is this paragon of virtue. Not true in the relationship related to how we handle slavery. And so when Ohio had enough people in 1802 to write a constitution, there began to be a movement to insert a level of slavery, as you can see, up to the age of 35, back in. Now, some of the leaders of the Ohio Company, Mr. Cutler and Mr. Putnam, lead the fight. Mr. Putnam is the one who said, I think Jefferson's hand was behind this. His dad had been a congressman. He was a friend of John Adams. He knew Jefferson, was involved in Jefferson. There's not any written evidence to actually blame Jefferson. Those of you who've been here before know I detest Jefferson, so it's easy for me to kind of lay on him, and I'm not going to. There's not any hard evidence, but of course I showed you what Mr. Cutler said in the process. Notice how close the vote is. It's defeated by one vote in committee. So, not to overpraise Ohio and the Northwest Territory citizens, as if they were all just very involved. They weren't. But in the Ohio Company land, and as we're going to see in Ripley, they were. And so you can see Ohio as being this place where there's continued tension. The tension will show up in various moments of riot. So Cincinnati becomes very important to our story. That's where Mr. Beecher goes, which I'll point out to you in a minute. But Cincinnati's one of the larger cities in what would be called the West at this point. And because of its close proximity to Kentucky, always had a deep involvement of Kentuckians, as they do today, crossing the river and shopping and going in and out of, Metro Cincinnati is actually in Ohio and in Kentucky. And so, they were aware of this, and as you can see, it led in 1828 and then into 1829, a mob violence against the citizens who were there. This $500, this would be like $20,000. So imagine the city of Winter Park saying, I'll use myself. Anybody whose history is in Germany, because you guys started those wars, you want to live in our city, you got to pay us $20,000. Just pay the $20,000, we'll hold it as a bond. Basically, if you do something crazy because you're German and you'll probably try to blow things up, then we'll use your $20,000. But you can see basically it was a way to limit, choose my example, German citizens from ever moving to Winter Park because we don't trust you people. So it's not $500. Like most of you could probably get your hands on $500 today if you needed to. It's $20,000. And I couldn't do that. I mean, you might be able to, but that'd be above my range. So you can see there's already this pressure against African American, whether freeborn or free acquired or a runaway, we don't want you here. It was ignored for a while because having the workers be useful, you should say, this sort of sounds familiar in how we talk about our immigration debates today. Exactly. Remember, anything that we're dealing with now has a long history, and not good or bad, but just you can learn more about it if you dig into what has been tried and done before. So, they destroyed basically an all-black neighborhood in Cincinnati. So I just show you this to see that there is this kind of growing tension. But at the same time, there's a spiritual movement happening, the Second Great Awakening, in which one of the outcomes, now when you look at our Great Awakenings, there's always some consistent religious, spiritual outcomes that are consistent across them. That's not our purpose. With all of our Great Awakenings as a country, there's always what I call to my students a non-religious outcome. And the non-religious outcome in the Second Great Awakening, there's actually two, but the one we want to look at is kind of the beginning of this new desire to have a new abolition movement. And so they're going to raise the abolition focus. And at this point, we can begin to see those who are in the story for abolition splitting into two groups. Now, this might seem odd to you and me, or maybe even offensive to you and me, but their thought was, what do we do with these people? We brought them here under duress. We stole them. We kidnapped them. Or in many cases, we bought them from other African people who sold them to us. What do we do with these people? And so there was one group who said, well, we send them back, which maybe makes sense if they just got off the boat a couple of years ago. But by this point, the vast majority, external slavery had been ended in 1809. So the vast majority of people here have been born here. This is why they don't want to leave after the Civil War's ended. They're like, I freaking built this place. Why do I have to leave? You white people should leave. And that gets in the Reconstruction story where, to me, we really dropped the ball on what we could have done. Different conversation. But this other group, who were really the more minority group initially, they're like, they should stay. They should stay, and we should try to integrate. Now, hopefully, you are aware that in the year 2024, it can still be considered challenging for us as a species to find ourselves comfortable with another who is different. I can't explain that other than to say it's in our species DNA, that we've somehow, Darwin, whatever you want to look at, when we're confronted with different, it makes us nervous. This is why when you go to the mall, it's why you go to a high school, you typically see people of same look and feel walking together. I personally don't think that's evil. I think it's just something in our system. But it then tells you how challenging it is, what these people were proposing. They're proposing we need to try to work against the normative state of the humans and create a society in which we will be comfortable with different. It's very difficult. And this is why I tell my students, and I'll tell you, what we've tried to do, we'll say for 250 years, although perhaps not really for the full 250, is remarkably challenging. It's an audacious, ridiculous thing that we are attempting. So if in your experience you feel like we do it poorly or have done it poorly or incompletely, I'd just say, cut us a little break, because we're trying something nobody else on the planet's doing. And the last time I checked the UN statistics, even within 10 years, we are still the only country that is really doing this with a truly multicultural, large minority group mixture. There are a handful of countries that have one large minority group, and then they have 7% of other. But we, have very large blocks of, broadly speaking, Asian, Hispanic, African, Caucasian groups working together. So, I'm not going to give us too hard of a pass, but still there ought to be some sense in that. So they're trying that, and you can see how this impacts. Rankin was an integrationist, Beecher was a colonizationist. He's like, send them back. That's what that meant. But both are abolitionists in the story, in the mix. So let's meet John Rankin. John Rankin was a pastor born in Tennessee, eventually moves to Kentucky, and in his mindset, abolition and ending of slavery and calling slavery out as an evil was a vital thing to do. He pays forward in both Tennessee and Kentucky and is ultimately forced out of those states. And so he moves north across the Ohio River from his city in Kentucky, Carlisle, and moves in 1822 into Ohio. This is when Reverend Rankin becomes really the central figure of what happens in the abolition movement, because his brother sends him a letter just saying, hey, here's what's going on. His brother Thomas, and he tells him he's living in Virginia. John probably knew that, and he tells him he bought some slaves. And so Thomas decides, this can't be. We're both raised in the same family, both had the same background. I can't believe you're doing this. So he takes it upon himself to write some letters to his brother. Then he makes a really fateful decision. From what we know, he didn't ever mail the letters to his brother. We don't know that he did both these things. He may have, but what we know for sure was that his neighbor ran a local newspaper. I don't have any evidence that the Castigator was an abolitionist newspaper. If it was one of the very first ones. I think it was just a local newspaper. But he was his neighbor, and Rankin published his letters in the newspaper. I don't know if he ever sent a copy to his brother. There are letters back and forth between him and Thomas. So at some point, Thomas knows what Rankin has written. But the point for you and me is, other papers see these letters and begin to publish them in the paper. And all of a sudden, John Rankin is really the first leading voice coming out of this time period to speak openly against abolition. His letters become so popular, he puts them into a book form. Here's my copy. You have to hunt for this online. You won't find this at Amazon, but you can find it. And it's just called Letters on American Slavery. And this is the first open writing of any American that we know of, or that I know of, who wrote against abolition. We want to kind of walk through this so I can show you his battles. Because as you can see, he's the reason William Lloyd Garrison makes his move. Garrison openly states this, that it was on the writings of Rankin that he felt the confidence to begin doing the Liberator. So again, our normative story that we hear is, Rankin, Garrison, the Liberator, he started this whole thing coming out of the Great Awakening. No, John Rankin in Little Ripley, Ohio, writes letters to his brother. And as you can see, Garrison, of course, takes this, and then all the things we already talked about. Rankin's letters are one of the first things that Garrison publishes in the Liberator. So you can see the importance of these people. In one sense, that we've lost these letters, and I would be willing to bet 100% of you have never heard of these letters. Some of you may have heard of John Rankin or Ripley. Is a sad moment, but that's why we're pressing on and I'm teaching it to you. So what he does, you think of who he is. Now this is, as somebody who's a Christian, and somebody who's actually served as a minister. All right, I pastored a church for 20 years. It's terrible to me and embarrassing to me to know that there were religious leaders who used the Bible to defend slavery. But that's the story, right? That's the facts. So think of what you have here is you now have an articulate, smart, forceful man who is himself a pastor coming out openly at a time when even in the North, it would have been a bad sign for him to be able to speak about abolition. And of course, this gives us a hint of what Ripley's like. Ripley embraced that. Ripley said, let's go for it, which leads us more into Ripley. But he makes this basic argument of saying, look, slavery is an evil, and he's writing this to his brother, but he's sort of talking to the country. Slavery is an evil. It's a form of tyranny, and if we're going to say we're a country based on the liberty of individuals, we cannot have these two things at the same time, period. And he goes on to build his defense, starting with the natural humanity of the African person, kind of leaning back into Locke. If Locke is who we're going to rest on, which we still basically do philosophically, that the individual has rights to life, liberty, and property, we said pursuit of happiness. Why? Locke's argument, because he's breathing, she's alive, ergo the end. Then Rankin's like, that's got to work for everybody. And to say it that openly seems obvious to you and me, but to most people they're like, well, I never thought of that. Which of course tiptoes into, which we won't talk about, but tiptoes into the decisions like the horrible 3/5 compromise, which basically says, and we see this really coming out in the Dred Scott decision, no, they're not people, they're property. But property are people, right? And Rankin's like, they're breathing, they're people, freedom is the natural position. Then he goes in to basically tell Thomas, look, this will lead you to your own immorality. And he lays out these reasons why. In other words, it's an immoral thing to deny somebody education. And that's what you do. You deny them education. It's an immoral thing to keep somebody in a horrible condition with low food or not as the same food that you would eat. It's a horrible thing that rape happens, so much so that, as you can see Rankin's statement here, the largest part of the master's own children are born of his slaves, whom he has basically prostituted as well as enslaved. The numbers might not support Rankin on that, but that rape was a common experience for African American women. Absolutely. No way of hiding around that. To say that the largest part may not quite be fair, or we may not be able to support that with the actual statistics and the evidence, but his point is a punch and it's in the right direction. And then he says, basically, owning slaves increases lawlessness in the white population because they can treat these people, their slaves, any way they want, and no slave can ever testify against them. So again, if you and I know we can break the law and get away with it, and the only thing stopping you is your own moral compass, and if that compass, if you decide you want that thing and nobody can stop you, maybe you'd be a person, you'd like to think you wouldn't be, but maybe be a person who kind of goes in that direction. Thomas at one point specifically again writes him back and says, hey, look, no, I'm a good guy, I'm doing good things, I'm being beneficial. This is one of the key arguments of the slaveholders all the way through the Civil War, actually all the way through Reconstruction. Their life in Africa is worse than their life here. We're doing X, Y, Z for them because they live here. We've done them a favor. And he's like, no. All your kindness to your slaves cannot atone for such a crime of sanctioning slavery. And he basically, again, goes back to, look, I mean, the human, we're kind of broken. We can do some harsh things to each other. So this just feeds that, if you allow yourself in this. And then he talks about the economics. He's like, look, these large plantations have harmed the economics in the South. And he's 100% right. One of the problems of the South by the time you get to the 1840s and 50s is that its economy is nearly ruined, leaning only on the wealth of the plantation owners, meaning that 85% of the regular folks, like my folks are from East Tennessee. Now, we didn't own slaves and we fought for the Union. But you know, there's a poverty because there's no, according to Rankin, I think he's right, at least at some level, there's no ability to kind of build in the opportunity that the American dream kind of says. The American dream is not about wealth, but the American dream is about opportunity. But if I live in a place where all the decent land is already owned by people who have 500 slaves and own 40,000 acres, I have no way to have that opportunity. And he's right on that process. But then he really turns the corner in some of the latter letters because he goes in on his spiritual side. He uses his role as a pastor to first unpack and take down, in my opinion, as somebody who knows the ancient languages and has studied the Bible for, well, a very long time. I'm older than I look. He really does a great job of taking the slavery argument apart at the specific points that pastors in the South were mentioning about the supposed support of slavery. And you can see some of his key arguments here. Basically the core position of the Bible is the freedom of the individual. And then he says any part where you would say there's an allowance in the Old Testament about slavery, for Rankin at least, is akin to the same thing Jesus says in the New Testament, that about divorce, it was only an allowance made, as Jesus said there, for the hardness of your heart. Then he flips it, and he says, let's look and see from his point of view, what does the Bible say opposing slavery? So then he gets into it and begins kind of walking through what he considers some of the key provisions. One of the ones that will have a lot to do with the Underground Railroad is this idea here that the provision in the Old Testament law for the Jewish people is that if someone shows up in your town and was somebody who had escaped from slavery, your role is to protect them, to house them, to keep them safe, to not somehow get them back to their master. That'll be a big role relative to what happens in the 1840s and 50s that we're going to see. And of course, he leans in here on the golden rule. I can't stress strongly enough how impactful this was for a pastor to come out as openly and as articulately as he does to kind of go at the position. In fact, his letters were so, you go back to here for a second, in my book at least, the one I have, he has one of his letters, not to his brother, so to begin there in the paper, but to a response of a letter he got or had seen in a southern Kentucky paper from another pastor. So another pastor in Kentucky is like, oh, I don't like this at all. And he writes basically a defense of slavery. So Rankin quotes him and takes it apart. So you have this sense of here's a leading religious thinker in this arena that is responding to slavery and using the Bible to both take apart the Southern defense and to then step into what does the Bible, in his opinion, and I would concur with Rankin, stance about slavery. And so at the end, he kind of brings out this kind of final, this thrust that abolition ought to be the way that we go. And he really is talking about one of the key things that all of us know in our hearts, which is why I hope you will look at the United Abolition or International Justice Mission or some others that work in ending slavery today and consider supporting them with your life and your time and your money, because none of us would take, even if we could be a slave to someone highly wealthy, and so therefore maybe your experience would be in a nicer part of town than you currently, none of us would trade that. Or I've never met anybody who would. So Rankin's making this argument for me 150 years ago, even more, that the most miserable of those who are free are not so miserable in every respect as are some in slavery. He will motivate not only Garrison, but a whole young generation of thinkers and young people who are coming up in their teens. And this takes us to Cincinnati. It's in Cincinnati that some abolitionists, Ebenezer and William Lane down in New Orleans and Arthur and Lewis Tappan of New York, said, we want to start a seminary in Cincinnati. And they call it after the Lanes, and it's called Lane Seminary. The Tappans are only willing to put the money in if the school will hire Beecher. So again, this is how we get to Harriet, because Harriet's going to move with her dad. She's 21 at the time when he gets the position, and he moves out there and begins this process of kind of being in that area, becomes the pastor of the Second Presbyterian Church. And even though his position was on recolonization, you know, it's still fair to say he's an abolitionist. Now, Rankin's letters and this kind of move shows up in the seminary in what are known as the Lane Seminary debates. So in Lane Seminary, one of the leading students was this man, Theodore Weld. Weld was someone who was opposed to the colonization viewpoint, and he said, hey, to the president, let's have a debate. You know how colleges are. They all have clubs and stuff. I was at UCF on Tuesday speaking there, and so as I walked across campus, you know, you had their little tables out for our club's this and our club's that. So there was a club there, both trying to vouch for abolition, but there was a club there for the recolonization group. There was a club there for the sort of the integration group. And Wells with that group. He said, let's have a debate. Which of these is the best option? So they do. And these debates are held over several nights. Pastors like John Rankin rode all the way to Cincinnati, which would have been a couple of days at least on his, to get there for him, to hear the talks. The talks are given, and Harriet Beecher is there as well, others. The overwhelming sense of the audience members, when it's all said and done, is that the integrationist position is right. Now, that settles it at Cincinnati, or at least with Lane Seminary. That doesn't settle it. Abraham Lincoln, who I've said before is not really an abolitionist, but he's certainly not really an abolitionist for integration. He was someone, even as late as 62, was thinking recolonization was the best plan. You don't have to bash him for it. It's just I'm pointing out to you that here, some 40 years later, the recolonization thought process was still viable amongst the abolition group. But the more energetic side of abolition, what we typically think of when we say abolition or the abolition movement, is this integrationist. Ending slavery immediately, getting these people into living life, wherever they would want to be, with all the rights and liberties of everybody else in that process. However, the Board of Trustees was a little concerned. Now, I've worked at Valencia College for 20 years. I've actually been close friends with both of our presidents. So I happen to know a little bit. Some of you may know a little bit. Board of Trustees, they're kind of the power brokers behind what happens out of school. And you can think of a school maybe connected to your favorite professor or to somebody who you know or their sports team. But really, people pulling the power is the Board of Trustees. And the Board of Trustees does not really want too much controversy at their school. So the Board of Trustees, after this has happened, says, you know what, this is way too much. We need these students focused on becoming good pastors, good seminary students, learning. So we're going to kick both groups off campus. But that'd be great. The students had other ideas, though, because the students had come away, as well as people like Rankin, who already believed it, but people like Harriet and others, going in the debate. The integrationists won. They won big. They won easily, right? So for the school to take that stance felt like the school leaders, the board, was backing down from a moral good. And as Rankin said, slavery is evil. So even the recolonization part felt like an evil. Does that make sense for everybody? So the students were like, all right, we'll just leave. So they do, and they move north from Ripley to Oberlin, right outside of Cleveland. And they will eventually begin to form Oberlin College, which was founded by a man named John Shippard. That is actually how I spelled his name. The Tappets pull their money out. They send it over to Shippen. One of the board members, Reverend Asa Mahan, he basically leaves with the students, and they go to Oberlin. And Oberlin will really become the first school to open its doors to an integrated student body. We'll come back to Oberlin because it's important to us. Again, trying to show you the story of Ohio. Y'all doing okay? Everybody good? Kind of rock along? All right, checking my time. Okay, the Lane students in this energy, I'm connecting it back to Rankin, but it's like it's seeping into Ohio. So, over here, this is where Marietta is. This is where the Ohio company is. It's becoming a hotbed for abolition. Here's Ripley. Here's Cincinnati, where Lane is. Now Webb here in Oberlin. In one sense, the entire state was becoming, battleground's too strong, but I'll use it, a battleground over this question of slavery. In a way that you don't see happening in Pennsylvania, in Massachusetts, in these other places. It's really this becomes, as I'm trying to argue, the center of the abolition story and question that we have before us. So into our story, just to show you how the mix is growing, the political side. James Birney. Now, Birney does not start off in the political side. He was just somebody who had been involved in slavery in the South. He, too, had been in Kentucky, eventually moves to abolition. While he's moves to Alabama. He does move to abolition. In Alabama was when he really started thinking, I don't like this. So he basically sells all his slaves and just kind of divests himself from that whole story. He actually wasn't a very successful businessman, but became someone who thought he could make a living with his words. So he wanted to start an abolition paper, kind of in the same ballpark as a Garrison. He can't do it in Kentucky, so he moves across the river to Cincinnati. So Birney will begin publishing The Philanthropist in Cincinnati. Now remember, we already seen Cincinnati once. They're not interested. It's kind of a mixed bag. And Battlefield probably is safe there. So as Birney begins writing, he gets the same kind of sense of frustration that begins to arise as an open, anti-black, anti-African-American, don't be in Cincinnati kind of story. And his writing is raising questions amongst, and it's a great snapshot for us, across the North. Well, maybe I don't want to even think about slavery. Maybe I don't want to have to deal with it. It's not here, so we're innocent, right? We don't have anything to do with it. But here's somebody openly talking about abolition and the fight for abolition. And in Cincinnati's case, to cut them a little slack, there's some financial merchants and shopping from Kentucky. And so their fear is, if we become known as this like center of abolition, will we pay a price financially? So with city leaders involved, the mayor was involved in this. They thought, well, we'll silence Bernie. So they eventually destroy his press, throw it in the Ohio River. He fishes it back out. They get it back out and everything. But then the riots, as often can happen with riots, get out of hand, and there's a sense of it's just not Bernie, it's all those people. And they go and have a night of violence against the African American community. And so again, you have Cincinnati kind of showing that in the North, it's not just some clean cut kind of thing. And this is the moment that Harriet Beecher has, I want to say her very first, but I think I got that from somebody at the Beecher House, and I don't, so one of her very first moments in which she wrote publicly, and she wrote into one of the Cincinnati papers, defending Bernie, defending the right for free speech, and basically saying, I wish I could have been at his house and give me a gun, I will defend his right to have, free speech and that kind of a thing. Okay. Now, mentioning the writings of Bernie and mentioning the writings of Rankin, I want you to see then how Rankin's writings really began to build this stream of a written narrative through the years between the writings of against American slavery to the Civil War itself, kind of positioning, raising the standard, raising the awareness of what's happening in the country with slavery. Again, to somewhat defend the North, you have to remind yourself that for most people in the North, they've never even seen a black person, let alone had any interactions with a slave. So it is a kind of out of sight, out of mind situation. So the writers here, and this is where Harriet will pick up later, which we'll get to in a second, are trying to say to the readers in the North, you can't ignore this. Well, it's going to take a while before they get enough momentum, but it's worth noting all these writers. Now, Weld contributes to this, and if you're someone who knows the story behind women's liberation and the right for the women to vote, you may know the Grimke sisters. So Thomas Weld will marry Angelina Grimke from South Carolina. Angelina and her sister Sarah and Thomas will spend time investigating the newspapers because the Grimke sisters were well positioned. They're from a very wealthy family in Charleston. They had access through friends and social relationships, and they will put together the book that they called 1,000 Witnesses, in which they will put into writing not just the stories, but the names. Now you can imagine in South Carolina and Southern society, once they did this, the Grimke sisters could never go back south and to their family ever again, because you now are outing people directly. Here's a name, here's an owner, here's this moment, here's when they sold their child into slavery, because when you're raping somebody and you have a baby born, that's your kid. It's one of the most, the rape itself to Carl is heinous. I think it gets topped by the fact that you would then keep your own child in slavery, and then topped yet again by selling your own child because you don't want to be faced with embarrassment if that's my kid. That just, as a father, that just makes me very frustrated with some of my southern neighbors who were alive at the time. But firsthand accounts, testimonials, it was very powerful. It caught the attention of the leading abolitionists in Congress, John Quincy Adams, and Thomas and Angelina will move and go live in D.C. and work with John Quincy Adams, who is the only president to ever return to national government leadership, elected offices. Taft will serve on the Supreme Court, but of course you're not elected to the Supreme Court. But so John Quincy Adams will stay in Congress and government after, and he becomes the dominant leading voice in the mid-30s all the way to his death. He dies basically in the Capitol, making speeches against slavery, and Weld will work with him for at least a period of time. So this takes us to the Underground Railroad. Again, I want to race to say to you, in one sense, when we say Underground Railroad, we're really talking about just the existence of the fact that people would seek to escape, and if they could find help, they found help. But I do think it's appropriate as we get into the 1830s and 40s to note that this thing takes on a life in the United States as a thing, but we can't ever give it like the agency of some organization. Like, there's no leader of the Underground Railroad. There's no elected officials. There's no planning. There's nobody who really orchestrates, particularly not on a national level. So it's both this amorphous kind of thing that just speaks to people getting out and others helping them. And yet at the same time, I think it is fair and appropriate to notice, well, there was a time when nobody used the term Underground Railroad. First time it's used, it's debated. There are 3 or 4 other cities that like to lay claim to this. So if you know of one, I respect that. I'm going to go with my boys in Ripley for reasons I'll point out to you in a second. But it was in Ripley that the first time, it wasn't called railroad because, of course, the railroad doesn't start till 29. This happens in 1815. A slave escaped, found his way into a sawmill. His owner and the posse eventually show up. Where is this guy? It's not clear whether the worker in the story that we have was literally trying to defend and protect the slave, or if he's just saying, I don't know. But he said, he's disappeared. He's gone on an underground road. Later, it will take on, as the railroad builds intensity as a thing, becomes really a dominant industry in the United States. People will talk about the Underground Railroad, and that's the phrase we use. But in Ripley, you kind of have it spoken this way. And the Underground Railroad, of course, is everywhere. And of course, us as Floridians, up until we became part of the country in 1820, slaves came here. So one of the first free black settlements is right outside of St. Augustine, Fort Mose. Some will call it Mosa. But Fort Mose was the first free African-American city formed. If you go to the fort, they almost always, I haven't been there in a while, so I don't know if they do anymore, but if you go visit St. Augustine and go to the fort, they usually have a room for Fort Mose, and it's an important one. I wish there was more too. We don't know the actual location because it's vanished to us from history, as often happens archaeologically and stuff. But in the West, you're going to cross Ohio. Now, remind yourself, why is that so challenging? Well, at this point in the country's history, most people didn't know how to swim. There weren't swimming pools. You might have swam in a pond, but you wouldn't have swam in a river because you didn't necessarily need to unless you're near the Mississippi. And certainly very few slaves knew how to swim. So if you were an escaping slave in the Upper South and you made your way to the Ohio River seeking the freedom, you knew to go north, you knew to follow the North Star, you knew to follow the drinking gourd, the Big Dipper. If you got there, you could get yourself to a river, you could see the other side, and unless you had a boat of some kind, you had no way across. All right? But at Ripley, the Ohio River narrows. Not to a tiny amount. It's still you go there, it's still a swim, but it's not as wide. So this is where Ripley begins to gain this momentum as people seeking freedom would find their way. Sometimes they would come down the river for 15 to 20 miles trying to see where's the best place to get across, and you get to where Ripley is, it was the narrowest. So Ripley becomes this kind of magnet to pull people into it. And for Southerners on the other side, well, you can see what they thought of it. And so Ripley becomes this kind of notorious place. And as you can see, by the late 30s, most of the entire citizenry, but not all, are on an official roster of the Anti-Slavery Society, which was basically code for the Underground Railroad. Not all of them were active every night seeking for people as others were, but still, if someone knocked on their door, they would answer. They would be there. And this is where we come back to the Rankins. Mr. Rankin, Reverend Rankin decided, I want to make sure it's clear my position on this story. And so he bought land on a hill that is over the top of the city, and eventually bore the name of Liberty Hill. He and his sons cleared the approach, so it was wooded when he bought it, cleared all the way so it's very clear, so that 2 things could happen. One, he could leave a lamp in the window every night, which soon became a beacon and soon spread throughout Ohio and eventually spread throughout the rest of the United States, that a lamp in the window was a beacon of this was a safe house. And in Ripley, it was a lit up city because most nights every house had a lantern burning in it. But again, this starts in Ripley, starts with Rankin. And he also had it cleared so he could see the coming of those who wanted to arrest him or kill him. And Rankin soon had one of the highest bounties on his head by Southern slaveholders to basically kill him or eliminate him. And more than once, he and his sons had to protect themselves in the house from either being burned down or being captured or being shot. They had a bridge. You can still go there today. It's right here. You can climb it. It's more than 100 steps. But in Uncle Tom's Cabin, we're told about Eliza climbing the steps to freedom. And what that meant was climbing the steps of Ripley, Ohio, up to Rankin's house, where Rankin could protect her, which is what she did. We'll come back to that in a second. $2,500 for capture and assassination is roughly $100,000, I think it is, or $80,000. So I don't know. You may have somebody who doesn't like you. I don't know if you put a price on your head, but $80,000. That's a lot. A lot of money at the time. And he would defend it. In fact, he wrote in an open letter at one point that he made sure got published into the Kentucky papers, basically this long talk that, have I done anything wrong? Have I harmed anybody? No, I am merely an abolitionist. That's his all caps, not mine. I do not recognize slaveholders' right to flesh and blood of souls of men and women, and I want you guys to know that I will not be deterred from what I believe to be my duty by fire and sword. It is my duty to defend my home to the very utmost. And that sentiment is what you will see in many of the Underground Railroad participants, white and black. Obviously, for a black participant in the Underground Railroad, they're probably facing immediate death or re-slavery. But for a white audience and participants, you're talking about jail time and a price on your head with the potential of murder. I don't know of anybody who has ever had a price on their head in the Underground Railroad. There might have been, but who actually was killed and then, somebody take it back to the South, here's their dead body, give me the money. But the fact that they would go that far to point people out and kind of point them into the story is worth our consideration. So by the time you get to the 1730s and the 40s now, Ohio, as I already said, is this kind of really a center place. Here's Marietta, here's Ripley, Cincinnati's over here, here's Oberlin. Oberlin was joined by 4 other cities up here, because obviously if you got to here, you could get people onto the lake and then over into Canada if they wanted to leave. Many did not leave. In Ripley, there was a vibrant African-American community of freed slaves called Africa on the Hill. And so they stayed, and they wanted to stay, and that was true in Ohio. So Ohio, again, go all the way back in your mind to Polk's first 15 of his 20 slaves. Seeing this sense of, why should I have to leave? I don't want to leave. I like it here. And the idea of the Ohioans really leading the country into this idea of, we will have to learn to live together, even though you look differently than I do. And you begin that process of community and engagement, which I hope you know, once you sit down and break bread with somebody, once you fix a fence together, you kind of realize nearly everybody is just a normal, basic human. They may not have all the same views you do, but they're not to be feared, right? When we other those other people, which we've done really bad in our country for at least the last 10 years, you kind of rob people of their humanity, and you rob yourself of the ability to discover their humanity, even if they still disagree with you or me on some key points. This leads us back to Bernie, because at this point, Garrison, who now is, it'd be fair to say, the national leader, is like, we really need to attack this politically. And so in 1840, you have the first abolition party that raises up. They called it the Liberty Party. It's a good name. And they tapped Bernie, because he's coming from the West, but he's well known through his writings, to be the candidate. He'll also be the candidate in 1844. And so you have this moment where the abolitionists now are seeking to make their move politically. By the way, this is the precise moment when Southern leaders like John C. Calhoun are going, uh-oh, this is going to move in a different direction. I don't know if we can compromise with these people anymore, meaning Northern people who don't have slaves. We might have to consider some other moves if they're going to be running for political office so that they could then change the laws nationally. I don't know if I like that. That's leaders in the South coming at this time where the party's going to run. The party will change. Well, another abolition party will come after the successful war with Mexico in 48, the Free Soil Party. Liberty Party will basically fold in time for the 52 party, and they'll race and they'll join together. I'll leave that there for now. This will, again, it's leading to more opposition. I just mentioned John C. Calhoun as an example for the South, but again, I stress to you, in the North. And you can see here, over 70 cities in the North, and by one account, over 150 villages in Ohio, all had moments between 1840 and 1860 where there are open riots of white people against abolitionists, against other white people, trying to create this abolition movement. They thought it was contentious. They thought it was stoking violence. They could see in writings by John C. Calhoun it's potentially threatening the security of the country. And to these people, they're like, we shouldn't do that. And you have to see in the minds of people like Rankin and Bernie and Garrison, they're going, I don't care. This is an evil I plan on opposing. And if it means violence, it means violence. So you have this coming tension of where you see the philosophical divide in the country leading us to a major clash. And you have one more specific one, this story here, about what happens in Cincinnati. So there's the three in Cincinnati and I'm not trying to pick on Cincinnati, it's just because Cincinnati's in Ohio, it kind of connects to the story that I'm trying to show you. But to show you that it's not Ohio's a paragon of virtue in which there's, only abolitionists. It really is this centerpiece and this kind of central place of tension, and you can see it in the villages. But New York, Philly, all these places are having moments where there's open rioting by people who don't want the abolitionists to win, to kind of take the day in the process. It is this violence that leads us to perhaps the most intriguing and most fun to study about citizen of Ripley, Ohio, John P. Parker. John P. Parker was an escaped slave. Well, actually, that's not fair. John P. Parker was a man who bought his freedom and moved to Ohio, moved first to Cincinnati, then eventually to Ripley. But by his own admission, he never wanted a photo taken of himself because he was afraid he could be used on a wanted poster. Because he became one of the leading citizens in Ripley of actively going across the river to see if there was any escaped slaves who needed a boat ride the other side. Look, I hope you'll go to Ripley. If you go to Ripley, Rankin House, please go see it. It's a national treasure. It's such a little place. It won't even take you an hour, but you should just go in that room and sit down and breathe in the air of know what these Rankin families do. But down the hill, almost immediately down there, you can almost look at it and see it. Close to the river is John P. Parker's house. And you can go to the Parker house and you can sit in and you can see and you can walk in his shoes as well. And John P. Parker is a fascinating man. We know of him because of a journalist who was actually from Tennessee but originally from Ripley, Frank Moody Gregg. Gregg had heard of Ripley's importance in the late 19th century, went to Ripley to do some research, discovered Parker, who was still alive, interviewed Parker. Even in 1890, being able to get a first-person account from a former slave was like gold. And yet, in 1890, it was also something that was still quite controversial, particularly in the South and even in southern Ohio, in which you now have Jim Crow laws which have relegated our African-American citizens and neighbors to second-class positions, supposedly separate but equal, but only separate, not equal. And so in that story, Gregg can't publish the writings. He eventually writes The Borderland in 1908, so almost over 20 years later. And he tells his version of what Parker said, but the actual transcript was in the Duke University archives, and this author, Stuart Seeley Sprague, got it out and published it. This I don't think you can find on Amazon either, but his Promised Land, it's a treasure. And you're reading the thoughts and writings of a man who was in slavery and then who was one of the central figures of the Underground Railroad. Everybody knows, you should know William Still. He's an important leader in the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia, but you should know John P. Parker. So Parker was born in Virginia, eventually sold to a doctor, gets into Mobile. As a young kid, as a teenager, like we've said already, he wanted freedom. And the fact that he wanted freedom kind of put his owner off. In one sense, we go, I understand that. I get that. His owner, though, was kind. He actually let him grow up with the two owner's sons. The two sons taught Parker to read and write, which was illegal, but they did it anyway. And the owner could tell that Parker was an intelligent young man, and he realized if you go work in the fields, your life expectancy will be shorter. So he helped him learn metalworking. And so he helped him go to metalworking. This is actually a hinge that's at the Parker house that John made himself for his house. He built his own house. And so he eventually will work with it's kind of a complicated story, but Parker will convince a patient of the doctor to buy him with the promise that he, Parker, will pay her back. Now the numbers here are just crazy. I made sure I had these for you. So $1,800 would be $75,000 today. And so that means each week, if he paid her $10, that's about $400, $415 a week. To do it in the time he did actually doesn't mathematically work out. So it means in some way that Parker had to earn another $1,000 extra. If you do the 10 weeks plus the time he was there, somehow he worked it out. Somehow, we don't believe she just let him go for cheap in the process. But he bought his own freedom. And eventually moves to Cincinnati in 48. While there, he gets his first tiptoe into the Underground Railroad, hearing of some slaves on the other side of the river who needed help. He was kind of volunteered and recruited, and so he went, and they found them, they got the girls out, they took them to Ripley, again, shortest distance across the river. While he's in Ripley, Parker realizes this is a better city for me to be in. There's less animosity. Most people are engaged, and he said, there's an iron foundry here, and I could get some work. So he did. So he moves in 49. Parker's writing in The Promised Land is just so powerful, describing his efforts and his involvement in kind of the story of the Underground Railroad. Again, it's important to realize in the Underground Railroad, there were literally thousands of white and black Americans whose names we'll never know, who participated, sometimes once, sometimes for their entire life. And it is basically a business you don't want to be known for. To let yourself be known was risky. In fact, again, without Greg telling us in the 1890s and us not finding out until 1908 of this guy named John P. Parker, he was unknown. But he actively participated in the saving of over 600 slaves on the Underground Railroad. It's a huge number in the process. He's the one that we were told the story about David's Underground Railroad name. He's the one who talks about Rankin, and he's the one that tells us about Ripley's position and his viewpoint. So he's a first-hand participant telling us the stories of the horrors of slavery. I know slavery's curse was not the pain of the body, but the pain of the soul. He successfully lives his life in Ripley towards the end of his life. After the Civil War, he'll participate in the Civil War. After the Civil War, he will continue working in foundry. He becomes the first African American to have a patent. I think that's correct. He's one of the few, let's say it that way. He's one of the few African Americans to have a patent. He had 3 patents. In fact, the soil pulverizer, I'm saying that a little slower, make sure I get it right. The soil pulverizer was something he had designed or thought of first in the 1830s as a way to eliminate the need for slavery, because you could have the work of 50 men behind this machine. It's one of the first kind of thinking, and we will have kind of an industrial revolution in agribusiness between, say, 1850 and 1890, and Parker's kind of in on that. All 6 of his children will go to school. 3 will go to Oberlin. Hortense is sort of well known in her story about being the first African-American graduates at Mount Holyoke College. So here you have, within a lifetime, a man going from being a slave to being upper middle class. According to some records, he was one of the 5 or 6 most wealthy men in the city of Ripley when he died. So that's the story of the American story. It's also the story of the Underground Railroad. At the time we get into the 1850s, you have upwards to 1,000 slaves escaping a year. And so there's this movement. Now again, from a historical point of view, if I can somewhat set aside my distaste for slavery and we say what's happening for the southern plantation, the southern economy, they're struggling, because to lose that much of your workers becomes a cost issue. So they're looking to the government to help them. The war with Mexico will really bring all this up to heighten, because now there's all this land that, from a geographic point of view, is south. So just think about extending Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. It's south compared to the rest of the continent, to which leaders like John C. Calhoun and others are like, that should be ours. If you get the Northwest Territories, and then through the decision of the Missouri Compromise, all the northern land, well, we should get all the southern land. Prior to the abolition movement, they might have won that conversation, but the abolitionists, John Quincy Adams and others, like, no, we're not going to go down that road. We will fight you on this. So this is going to lead to a tension And one of the things that comes out of the Compromise of 1850 to help get us past this blow-up in 1850, there was a real sense that the war could start in 1850. Meaning it's not just that Lincoln was elected and 61 happens. 1850, there was some real discussion of we'll just go to war over this. There was a compromise, but one piece of the compromise involved creating a new Fugitive Slave Act. It was an energized, it was a more powerful Slave Act. It gave more energy to the federal marshals. It gave more ability for the federal marshals to kind of act and move, and so they will begin this process. It is the Fugitive Slave Act that will then lead Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. She's again living in Maine at this point. She has all the stories from Cincinnati. She knows different things that her dad has told her. She knows she's been a constant correspondent to the Welds. She knew things she'd heard from Reverend Rankin. So she told the local editor, I think I could shed some light for our people living up here in Maine, what slavery is really like. What do you think? And he's like, yeah, do it. She thought she'd write 3 or 4 articles. As you can see, she eventually will write more than 40. And so she puts in the paper, and eventually the enthusiasm behind these letters will convince Harriet, now Harriet Beecher Stowe, to put them into a book. And she puts them in the book in 1852. The book is explosive. You can see the numbers that were sold. There are more I'm not sure if the numbers in Great Britain that there's more of is because there's more energy for abolition. They'd already banned slavery in Great Britain at that point, or if it's a testimony to the stronger printing industry in Great Britain. But even the 300,000 copies in the U.S. alone outsold everything but the Bible. And so now all of a sudden you have this writing. It's written in a way that is more emotional compared to the things you might have read by those other people on the list that I showed you earlier. And so there's this emotional sense in which Eliza is telling these stories. It is not fiction. It might be, someone could argue, historical fiction, but I think that's going too far. Harriet would tell you every story in the book was a true story that she knew of personally. And that's the important part of it. She does model the Uncle Tom character after Josiah Henson. And people questioned Eliza. Was Eliza just a trope that you put in of the woman in peril to kind of emotionalize the story? And Harriet's like, oh, no. I heard this from, she never says Rankin's name. John P. Parker and others will say it is Rankin. And Harriet Beecher's dad will say that it's Rankin, but that she never puts his name in print, mostly to protect him. But Rankin tells the story, and Parker relays the story in his writing of one of the many. Rankin and his family assisted over 2,000 people escaping from the Underground Railroad. One of the stories being the story of Eliza, and that she was aided, and that she was helped. And if you read the story in Uncle Tom's Cabin, she's struggling her way across. It's an icy river. She gets help from somebody in Kentucky who's like, you're never going to make it carrying a baby, and again, know how to swim. And here, carry this long piece of wood so when you fall in, it'll catch on the ice. And she does, and falls in 2 or 3 times and struggles and finally makes her way. Man, I don't know if I could carry a 4 or 5 foot piece of wood and a baby at the same time. And she makes her way over. And then she gets to Ripley, and according to Parker, the person she meets is this man, Chance Shaw. And Parker says that Chance was one of the few people in Ripley who was not a part of the anti-abolition or the abolition society. In other words, she met one of the few people in Ripley who wasn't active on the Underground Railroad. And the story goes, as Harriet tells it, that as he saw her struggling across, he said, anybody who puts that much effort for your freedom deserves it. And he said, all I can do, he helped her out of the water, and he said, you need to go there, and pointed up the stairs. And he knew the stairs took her up to Reverend Rankin's house, where the light was on. She then goes in, stokes up the fire to warm herself up. John and his wife come down, meet her, feed her, take care of her. She spends the night there, and then the next day, or maybe the day after, they get her on her way. Eliza's a real person, as are the other stories in the Uncle Tom's Cabin story. And it's a major, major movement. When you look at the road to the Civil War, we're almost done. When you look at the road to the Civil War then, it is this moment with the Compromise of 1850, the Increased Fugitive Slave Act, and then 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is written in response to the Fugitive Slave Act, that you finally now see the quick, what I call the road to the Civil War, the intense beats that will happen. And I want you to note here in the last few minutes that we have, how many of the beats happen in Ohio. They all happen because of Ohio. They all happen because of Ripley and Reverend Rankin. First thing is, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed in 1854. One of the many people who went from the north out to Kansas, because it was going to be basically a race to who get the most people there to free or slave, was a man named John Brown. You may have heard of John Brown. He took his sons out there, took other people out there. Meanwhile, Harriet's brother, who was a pastor in New York, in Brooklyn, at a church that was known as Grand Central Station for the Underground Railroad in New York, started raising funds to send rifles that he put into crates marked Bibles that become known as Beecher's Bibles. So the Beecher family, deeply involved in the Underground Railroad and deeply involved in now, by the time you get to 1850, the really open fight about what happens to slavery. In fact, the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 54 will lead to what we call Bleeding Kansas, which, for all intents and purposes, the Civil War starts right there. Not at Fort Sumter in 1861. It starts in Kansas in 1855. Now, open warfare between Americans. It's not declared, but it happens beforehand. So then this leads to 4 years later, up in Oberlin, a slave named John Price was captured by the Fugitive Slave Act marshals. They capture him right outside of Oberlin. They take him into Oberlin to a place called the Wellington Hotel. Most of Oberlin was, like Ripley, abolitionist. So a large part of the city turns out, including many students from Oberlin College, and they basically attack the hotel. A federal marshal is killed. They rescue John Price, and they send him on his way to get out of the city. The U.S. government tries to press on the people who fought, and they willingly go to jail. They kind of are sort of, in one sense, anticipating the movement that happens in the 1950s and 1960s with the SNCC and with the SCLC and Dr. King and the others who basically passive accepted the jail to kind of flood the jails, fill the jails up. We won't post bail because this is an unjust sentence. Meanwhile, in the city of Oberlin, the city leaders will basically charge the federal marshals with kidnapping, and they'll have the federal marshals arrested in Oberlin over trying to kidnap a resident, John Price. And so you can see this battle. This gets into this, who's in charge, the state, the Fed, over who's going to be a part of it. This act then leads John Brown to say, okay, we have to make our final move. So in 58, remember, he had been out there. One of the things he did, now this is heinous, this is terrible, but this shows you the level to where people like John Brown had gotten to. One of the things he does in Kansas is after there's an attack on Lawrence, the storming of Lawrence that happens in Kansas, in the Bleeding Kansas moment. So one response was John Brown and his sons kidnap 2 slaveholding families and execute them to free the slaves. And so then now he's back in, and he hears of the Oberlin Wellington Rescue. He's from a city right outside of Oberlin, right outside of Cleveland. So he goes and begins to recruit people to lead an armed insurrection in Virginia, which of course, as you know, as the raid on Harper's Ferry. The raid on Harper's Ferry happens because John Brown's from Ohio. It happens because he takes some of the rescuers from Oberlin with him. It happens because Oberlin College is started because of the Lane debates. It happens because John Rankin first wrote letters to his brother saying, this thing needs to stop. Now the Harper's Ferry story, let me check my time, I don't take it too long. Harper's Ferry story is well known. So much issues. John Brown's actions will really be the tipping point. When you're doing the beats, there's some that I didn't tell you. There's about 12 or 14 between the war with Mexico and Lincoln's election. And Harper's Ferry is like the last one before Lincoln's election. By this point, the country is completely divided. To the Northerners, the fact that he was executed on treason against the state of Virginia was evidence to them that the Southerners despised or rejected the power of the federal government, and so they would never comply. To the Southerners, the fact that this man brought armed weaponry to bring death, like he did in Kansas, to slaveholders was proof that the North had no goodwill in them and no desire to actually, compromise with them. So the fact that we get to 60 in the election and 61 with Fort Sumter is just obvious. It's not like, wow, why did that happen? You can see it happening here. And this then is kind of where we kind of end up, in that John Brown knew it. It's not fair to say John Brown failed. There's a sense in which he wanted to be a martyr, or at least was open to martyrdom as an outcome, and in that process was willing to suffer for it, which will lead us to our third abolition party. They'll decide the Free Soil Party just sounds weird, and they're like, we need a more historic name. What's a name we can use? And they go, oh wait, what's a political party that used to be that isn't anymore? The Republican Party. It links us to Jefferson, and that's good in people's minds because of the Declaration, and we'll make it an abolition party, which there's irony there that Jefferson's party becomes the name of a party of abolition. It'll work out for us. And of course, you know that Lincoln's elected. Let me wrap it up with this. The nation was unwilling to focus or think about abolition. It took a small group of individuals willing to fight that fight. And the publication of John Rankin's letters really is the pebble down the hill that leads us to people like Douglass, that leads us to people like Garrison, and it gives somebody like Harriet Tubman the agency and the access to do the wonderful things that she does, both the east and the west of the country, kind of moving in this direction. And once you get into the Fugitive Slave Act and you have Harriet Beecher Stowe writing about this in Uncle Tom's Cabin, the emotional punch of that, for us it'd be like a movie that kind of demonstrated something in a way that wasn't kind of a lecture, but it kind of brought you in as a story. You felt compassion for the story leaders, who's the heroine of the story. And then to see something unfair, unjust happen to them, you walk out of the theater going, that's terrible. That can't be that. And that all comes and centers for us on Ohio. I like this quote. There's some potential that it's apocryphal. I like to tell you the truth about what we find in history and the evidence. But after the war, Beecher's son, Harriet's brother, was asked, well, who abolished slavery? And he said, Rankin and his sons. And that's the wonderful, curious story of how a little village called Ripley, Ohio, became the center point of the abolition movement that led to the ending of slavery with the passage of the 13th Amendment coming out of our Civil War. Ta-da! Yes, sir.
That's one of the most cogent explanations of the road to Fort Sumter
Thank you.
I've ever heard. My question is, as a Presbyterian, do you think it was a coincidence that both Beecher and Rankin were Presbyterian ministers?
No, because if you're leaning more into the Calvinist part of that question, but certainly from a sense of the Presbyterians and the Baptists in the 1780s and forward were kind of the two really energetic groups. The Presbyterians become one of the leaders. In fact, it might be fair to say the leading Christian denomination for abolition, but again, it's still a minority position. Good question. Other questions? Got a few minutes. Yes, ma'am. So he eventually, he's born in Norfolk, he's taken to Mobile, and he's sold down the river, down to slavery as a child, down to Mobile, Alabama, and lives in and around Mobile. He actually lived some of the things that slaveholders would do if they thought they could trust the slave is they would kind of rent them out. So he lived part of his life closer to the Mississippi. Then Mobile's not on the Mississippi, obviously, but he was on the Mississippi. A couple of his youthful escape events in his teenage years were on the Mississippi. And that's sort of what led his owner in Mobile to go, you're making me look bad, you're kind of bringing me trouble, I'm hearing these letters of you being a troublemaker, I'm just going to sell you. And it would have been sold to being a farmhand more than likely, which was why then Parker worked out with the woman patient, which imagine her life. I mean, it's one of those stories where you're like, that can't be right. And so, we only have Parker's testimony of it, but there's no reason to doubt the man. Most people are not notorious liars or compulsive liars. So yeah, and so then he comes up the river to get out of the South, and we took a boat up the Mississippi with his. He was legal because he had bought his freedom, and took a riverboat up the river, and got to Cincinnati, thinking it'd be the best place for him. I usually post this lecture and other lectures that I give from history. And currently right now, I'm also releasing a podcast that's connected to a degree that I'm getting, which is investigating some aspects of our national story relative to history. It's more complicated than that, which I can tell you if you want. But you can find all that on my YouTube. If you use the QR code, you can just hold your camera up, take a picture, it'll take you right to YouTube, and you can subscribe. It'll tell you when things are released. Like this will be on here in a couple of days, it'll be up there. And if you want to show it to some friends or anything like that, that's on there. If you do podcast and you just want the podcast and you already are on podcast services, then you can get there through my website. But the QR code is a way for you to hop right directly to YouTube. Thank you, as always, so much for coming. You coming helps us support these kinds of things at the library, and your attendance is wonderful. If you have any questions you want to come ask me personally, I'm always available for you. Have a wonderful afternoon.